Hi there. So in this lecture, we're going to talk about some pre-Roman history and culture. And what I have here is just a bunch of dates and different time periods in Roman history. And I haven't said this before, but you really don't need to memorize dates for this class. You just need to know sort of general details, general outlines. So the first part of this prehistory we're going to look at is the Neolithic. And this is, I have to say, a massive field in Roman history. And I'm going to cover it extremely briefly. So within these different time periods, scholars have named things in different in ages. So for example, you've got the Neolithic, and I'll talk about what that means in just a second, but you also have the Copper Age, or the Chalcolithic, and I've given you the dates here, about 3000 to 2000 BC. They're sometimes named after the metals that people are actually using. So then you move into the Bronze Age. That little twiddle before the 2000 just means about, so about 2000 to 1600. And then we move into a period of time when people are using iron, and this is the Iron Age. And in Roman history, this is broken down into different names depending on the geographical point that you are looking at in Italy. So for example, you can have the Villanovan age, and I've given you the dates here. And sometimes these periods are broken down depending on the archaeological finds, like 1 and 2. So for example, on this slide you can see early Iron Age in the Villanovans, where Villanova 1 is about 900 to 800 BC, Villanova 2 is 800 to about 720. And then after that period, or actually right during the period, you get something called the glacial culture. And this is more Roman than anything. And then you get, and I won't talk about this in this lecture, but we'll talk about the different connections to the cultures that were all already in Italy, which were the Etruscans to the north and the Greeks to the south. Okay, so the Neolithic. This is, and I say this in all of my classes, for me it's one of the most important time periods in human history. It's where people start to learn to farm. And this is a Greek word. Let me see if I can get the little pointer to work. So you've got neo, which means new, and lithic, and these are Greek words, in Greek means stone. So the Neolithic is the new Stone Age, which isn't quite the best name for it, but that's what it's been called. But what you need to remember is this is when people learned how to farm. It's also a time period where you've got the domestication of wild animals. If you look around at various sites, and we'll talk about a specific site in just a second, Tavoleri, you will see that what normally happens in the progression of the Neolithic is that people start to farm, and then they need some place to put their food, so then they start creating pottery. Now we don't know like exactly who started to make pottery first and so on. So we just know that it shows up. And some of the pottery is called impressed ware, meaning there are little incisions or little spots where someone might have taken their fingernail and gone into the pottery, or they've taken a stick and made decorations. I'll show you an example here in just a second. So you do have pottery. You do have, as I mentioned, domestication of animals. So in particular, you find sheep. And we know this from the bones that have been discovered at these Neolithic sites. Now, as I mentioned, one site that I've given you the option to read about is a site called Tavoleri. And as you can see here, it's from southern Italy. There are hundreds of Neolithic sites in this area. And it's really interesting. It was actually discovered by people flying over Italy after World War II and noticing that there were lines and fields that you couldn't necessarily see if you were walking. And so they started doing archaeology, and it turns out it's this massive Neolithic area. Archaeologists have found huts where people have been living or have lived. These are sometimes surrounded by ditches, which, go ahead and read the article on Tavoleri, but there's been a number of ideas of what these ditches are, their protection, maybe storage for water, and so on. You find grinders for grain, so that's usually one thing you find in the Neolithic period. You've got your grain being grown, you need to do something with it, you grind it up, and then you make bread or do whatever. We also find tools. So obsidian is a very hard, shiny rock. And the nice thing about obsidian, you see this all over in the Neolithic period throughout a lot of areas, is that if you break it just right, you get a very sharp edge. So it acts like a knife. So you find these things in the Neolithic period. This is a photo taken from the article titled New Data on the Neolithic Ditches of the Tavillere Area, page 14. And what you're looking at here, so these lines here, these have been highlighted, but as I mentioned, this whole area was discovered by flying over it and seeing spots in the fields that you wouldn't see normally. So what you're looking at is a modern agricultural field. You can see some buildings down here, but you've got these lines. And so what they did is they did some archaeology, and these are some of the ditches. And I've given you some information here. This is coming from page 14 of the article. You've got one ditch here that's 2.34 meters wide. Now, they're 3 feet in a meter, so maybe 10 feet wide and a little over 3 feet deep. And then you've got a little bit larger one, ditch B, which is about 13 feet wide and almost 2 meters, so about 5 feet deep from the surface. And they've done quite a bit of archaeology in these particular ditches. Now, when you read the article, what you'll read about is all the different things that they found in these ditches. And one thing was Neolithic pottery, and I just mentioned that. And here's some really good examples of inciseware, where it looks like, you know, this might actually be someone's fingernail, where they've just sort of pressed into the clay. You've got different decorations here and so on. So people are living in this area. They are eating the food that they're growing. They're making pottery, and they've got time because they're being fed from the fields to make decorative pottery. And then moving on, almost in the same area, and this is the case too for the rest of Italy, you've got something called the Copper Age, or Chalcolithic, about 3000 to 2000 BC. More than likely, as far as we can tell from the archaeology, this is just a continuation. So the people who are living there in the Neolithic are still living there, and they're moving on in terms of technology. So you start to find, no big surprise, copper. Copper tools, copper weapons. Now, if you know anything about copper, it's very soft, but it's an ore that you can just dig up from the ground, heat up, and make your tools. And the ore, we know from the studies done on some of these metals, is coming from the north in Tuscany and further north from the Alps. So when you think about these time periods, don't just think, like, okay, they've got a copper tool. Think about what that actually means. So someone's making it. Someone's actually digging it up first, then heating it up, making this into tools, and then whether the ore is coming down into the middle part of Italy and the southern part of Italy, and the tools are being made there, or they're being made in the north and brought down, it's talking about economy. So you've got these tools coming into Italy from the northern parts, and then people must be trading. And here's a really good example of a copper axe, or maybe a hammer. So what you're looking at here, it's sitting on a plexiglass post, and you've got this spot here which held the handle. And I've given you the website here if you want to go and read about this particular copper axe. You also find various decorative objects that people would wear in these particular sites. So what you've got here, you know, like a necklace, these are probably tools. As you can see, there's a little hole. Oops, if I can get that to right. Little hole here, so maybe it hung on a string or something like that. Certainly, you can see holes here, so this might have been part of a necklace and so on. So don't think about Neolithic people as being like cavemen. They were just people living in a different time, doing almost the same things that we were doing, or we are doing today. Okay, then you move into the next age, which is bronze. And I put up here on the slide, bronze is a mix of tin and copper. So this is a higher form of something called metallurgy, which is the working of metals. So You've got copper, which we talked about from the previous age. Someone discovered that if you melt about 10%, give or take a few percent, tin into copper, you get a much harder metal. And so I've given you the dates here for the Bronze Age. You also start to find different things happening in some of these sites. So you find houses. You find possibly trade with other people. So the Mycenaean period in Greece dates to about 1600 BC to about 1100 BC. And so you're finding little bits of Mycenaean pottery in some of these sites, which again is probably showing some type of trade. You find the food that's being grown, so wheat, barley, beans, acorns, and the animals that they have domesticated. So cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. And as I put here in lesser numbers. Now, what these archaeologists are doing is they're counting up the number of bones that they're finding, and they're determining what the animals, which animals belong to which bones. And of course, you also find pottery. Now, you do have something called the Late Bronze Age, and I've given you the dates here. This is also called Proto-Villanovan. Proto just means early. So early Villanovan culture, and we'll talk about this in the next slide just really briefly. We know a little bit about these people. We know that they cremated their dead, and that's where we're getting most of our information from. They're definitely working with bronze. They're making weapons, making various vessels of bronze. And what you're looking at here is the way that they buried their dead. So what you've got here is something called a well tomb. So this is ground level here, and what they've done is they've dug a hole. And then what you've got here is a container within a container. And within this middle container is the cremated remains of somebody. They've done some studies. Most of these are males. And then this one next to it is just another example where they've dug down, put the jar in there of the cremated body, put that in a jar, and then buried the whole thing. I will say too, we're going to talk about the Etruscans in the next lecture, but these are people who are living just a little bit north of where the Romans will start showing up. And it's thought that maybe some of these Villanovans become the Etruscans a little bit later. And then as you move into the later part of this period, you get more settlements. So what that's telling you is the population is growing. If you start looking at the grave sites and something called grave goods, so that's anything in a grave that's not the body, you start to find things like armor. People are definitely riding horses. You're finding decorations, especially in the women's graves, necklaces, brooches. Spindles, this is really interesting. This is showing you that people are making probably clothing or different cloth with wool. So as you can see from the Neolithic period up through about this period, things are changing. So people are getting more organized. If you're starting to find bronze armor, you should think about, well, what does that mean? It means they're probably fighting. And then you have to think of, well, who are they fighting with? And so then you start looking at a map of where all these different areas are and trying to figure out who's fighting with whom. When you start to look at the grave sites, you start to see some that are more wealthy. And so what this is probably telling you is that there are now different levels of society. So you've got the rich who are being buried with lots of grave goods, and then the poor with being not so many. One thing you also see here, a little bit of a change in the burial rites, is that early Villanovan culture, they were cremating their dead. Later culture, they start burying the body, which is what inhumation is. And then in the next lecture, we're going to talk about the Etruscans and the Greeks who are living in southern Italy.